Everybody, this is Joseph P. Farrow with news and views from the Nefarium on late Thursday, August 4th, early Friday, August 5th. And the Nefarium has been busy. There's some interesting consequences. If you've been watching the Turkish coup and its aftermath, there are now beginning to develop some very, very interesting consequences that I want to talk about a bit today. And I want to thank everybody for continuing to send articles and everything. It's been very, very important, particularly watching this story. Now, the first thing I want to point out in today's story is an article that I've linked from Stratfor. It's a very short article, datelined July 28th. And the headline here says it all: Turkey, protesters moving toward Incirlik Air Base. And then the actual article says demonstrators are moving toward Incirlik Air Base in southern Turkey at the city of Adana for anti-U.S. protests, images circulating on Twitter on July 28th show. It is currently unclear how many people are taking part in the demonstration. The base houses thousands of U.S. and NATO military personnel and has served an important role in the U.S. the U.S.-led coalition's aerial operations against the Islamic State targets in Iraq and Syria. In other words, this is an absolutely vital airbase in the American empire, and particularly in the NATO structure. With that in mind, I want to turn to a lengthy article that appeared in Russia Insider. I've put the link up there for you. This article is titled "The New Byzantine Alliance, the Kremlin, and the Port," and that obviously being a reference to the Sublime Port, which was what officials back during the day of the Ottoman Empire called the residence of the Sultan. So in other words, if you referred to the Sublime Port, that would be like saying the White House today, all right? The Kremlin and the Port revolutionized the center of the world. Now, there's quite a few interesting things in this article that I want to read to you before giving you what I think we have to look for in the future vis-a-vis what the article is suggesting. It begins by pointing out that this month, in 4 days, that is to say, Monday and Tuesday, President Vladimir Putin and Tayyip Erdogan, President, or I prefer to call him the Sultan of Turkey, are going to be meeting in Russia. All right. And this article is kind of giving you the background now for what's been happening prior to this meeting. Quote, Russian sources say that they are sure the Russian secret services did not warn Erdogan or help his forces prevail in the July 15th to 16th coup attempt against him. After Erdogan began his counter coup, and in the fight still continuing between Erdogan's Islamic forces. Now, please note, Russia Insider is admitting that Erdogan represents an Islamicist tendency within Turkey. Between Erdogan's Islamic forces and the regular Turkish military, the sources said, there has been and will be Russian help. It is more for the future, they explained, than for last week's outcome that the Turkish Deputy Prime Minister Mehmet Shishak told his counterpart Arkady Dvorkovich in Moscow on Tuesday. Quote, I would like to thank you for your support regarding recent events in Turkey, for supporting democracy and the Turkish government, unquote. Russian sources say it is already agreed the two sides will pay a soon-to-be-settled price in this two-way trade: gas, nuclear, and other energy projects, plus tourism. Much more is at stake, though, one of the source adds. Putin and his advisors believe Erdogan is still in danger. They support him now for the opportunity to reorganize the relationship with Turkey, and that's at the heart of it. That's right at the heart of it. Now, let me explain why. The coup leaders were pro-Western secularists. In other words, they were definitely wanting to keep Turkey within the orbit of NATO and within the hegemon of the United States. And under that policy, you'll recall Erdogan was following U.S. policy very, very closely until just prior, please remember this, just prior to the coup, he suddenly reversed course. He decided to reopen his negotiations with Assad, renormalize those relationships, break off the Turkish support for the American-led ISIS group in Syria, renormalize relations with Israel, and most importantly, he sent a letter of apology to Vladimir Putin for the Turkish downing of the Russian fighter last year and offered full compensation to the Russian family that lost their loved one in that incident. So in other words, Erdogan reversed his policy prior to the coup across the board. This is key and crucial. This means that Russia views Erdogan as a more sure and stabilizing bet than any sort of pro-U.S. secularist Turkish government. This is what's going on here, and this is a huge readjustment of the entire geopolitical landscape in the Middle East. Now, let me continue. They mean to secure Russia from encirclement. In other words, Turkey is breaking this wall that the United States and its allies have been trying to build around the around Russia. This is a key crack in that wall. They mean to secure Russia from encirclement on the southern frontier in the Black Sea, dismemberment of the Caucasus, and attack on the Kremlin by its enemies. Right now, as Europe collapses, the enemy is the U.S. with NATO in support. If Turkey breaks with the U.S., NATO is a paraplegic. We shall see how Putin and Erdogan choose to portray the new Rome, the new Byzantium, next Tuesday. The new alliance agenda, please note this is Russia Insider, and those are its words. The new alliance agenda was formalized at a Security Council meeting on Monday afternoon. The Kremlin announced, quote, the president briefed the permanent members of the Security Council on his recent telephone conversations with President of Turkey Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Prime Minister of Israel Benjamin Netanyahu in the context of preparations for the visit by the President of Turkey to Russia scheduled for early August. Now, folks, that's the earthquake right there. Now, let me continue before I get into any sort of analysis or prediction of what I think we can watch for. There's a few more paragraphs in this article I want to read to you. Quote, in an analysis of the military operations in Istanbul and Ankara, Yevgeny Kritikov, the correspondent of Siglad in Moscow, has reported that there was no coordination between the Turkish Army, Navy, and Air Force, poor command and control within each of the services, and inadequate troops and firepower on the streets to combat the turnout in Erdogan's favor. In other words, if you went to coup school, you just executed and attempted to plan a coup in the worst possible way because there was no coordination in the three branches of your military, and there was no clear command and control structure of the people executing the coup. That is a recipe for certain failure, and that's what makes me suspicious to this day about this coup. All right. It's so poorly executed when, in fact, if you look at the history of the Turkish army and coups, it's pulled them off before. All right. So I have some suspicions to this day about just who's behind this coup. But continuing now with the Russia Insider story here. Russian sources are non-committal on what role U.S. military and intelligence agencies played during the July 15th events at the Incirlik Air Base and elsewhere to encourage or not discourage the attempt at overthrowing Erdogan. What is certain now, as Erdogan tries to mop up, according to Greek and Cypriot analysis, listen carefully here, is that Turkey has turned against the U.S. and NATO alliance. Turkey is now moving away from Western dependence, says a well-formed region source who asks not to be identified. This makes sense geopolitically because the West has lost control in the Middle East. Other close Western allies in the region, like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, are becoming autonomous in the sense that they don't obey the U.S. This is because the U.S. can no longer act as a hegemon. Washington can't dictate or even recommend solutions to conflicts or rivalries like in Iraq, Syria, Libya, or Palestine. Now, without direct U.S. involvement in the Turkish coup, Erdogan sees his chance to make Turkey more autonomous, so he is taking it, unquote. Russian sources agree, referring to Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, whose plan of attack against Russia in the Ukraine, Turkey, Syria, and Cyprus have been reported. A Moscow source concludes the Nuland plots have all failed. The U.S. can no longer talk to the Turks. Losing Turkey to Erdogan and his Islamists, there's the word again, also means that the U.S. can dictate no longer in the region. You can't expect the Americans will take it lying down. There's no government in Washington right now. Please note those words. But if Clinton wins, there will be a U.S. fight back, but it will be too late. And I agree with that analysis. Greek, Cypriot, and Russian sources questioned about the current course of events say the principal Russian objectives are obvious. Erdogan should stop the support of the jihadis, ISIS, and sedition towards the Russian Caucasus in the form of the Chechens. He must stop his regime-changing tactics in Syria and not less in the Balkans and in Central Asia. The sources believe that in his current predicament, Erdogan is a better bet for the Kremlin than the Turkish military, or the so-called Kemalist or Gulenist political groups, encouraged by the U.S. If the pro-American or NATO elements can be uprooted and destroyed, Russia is bound to feel more secure so long as Erdogan's Sunni Islamic orientation will make its peace with Russia. Note that is a crucial condition, as the Shiites of Iran and Iraq are doing. A well-known Cypriot analyst observes Cyprus is better off, though the situation around us is tragic. At least hegemony, that is to say, Western hegemony, is finished. This is good because a large part of the Cyprus problem came from that very same Anglo-American hegemony and its efforts to maintain itself. Their subversion of Arab modernization. Please note that what the Greek analyst is saying is it's been the West that's been behind driving radical Islamic groups. Their subversion of Arab modernization has been the greatest crime of the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. Now, please note that Russia's demands here are, as I pointed out, already more or less being met by what Erdogan did shortly before the coup attempt. As I say, he completely reversed policy here. So in other words, the break with NATO was underway prior to the coup attempt. And this is why I think there is a strong argument that that coup may have at least been tacitly supported by the United States and NATO. But now what's the fallout here? This is what I really am concerned with. What might we expect in the future from all of this? Well, first of all, I think you're going to see this is going to spread. I think it's going to spread from Turkey to Greece, first of all. I think Greece is next in the NATO dominoes that might not only fall, but actually pull out of NATO. And of course, what works in Greece's favor here is that Russia and Greece share a common cultural background in Eastern Orthodoxy, and that could revive the role. And we've been hearing little hints of this out of Russia, of its traditional role as protector of Orthodox Christians, not only in the Balkans, but in the Middle East. So in other words, I think you're going to see Russia pressing for an end to the persecutions to Christians. And I think you're going to see Erdogan go along with it. And if Erdogan goes along with it, this is going to spread. This will put tremendous pressure on Saudi Arabia, which also has been courting Russia. But I'm looking for Greece to be the next nation to go the way of Turkey here and buck the U.S. hegemon and NATO. All right. Then the next thing I expect is that this is going to spread through the Balkans. Now, Romania won't do this. Romania remembers the communist regime of the Ceausescus, remembers the Soviet era. Poland won't do this either. But I suspect that this is going to spread to Italy, to Spain, and to France. In other words, this is going to put tremendous pressure on NATO. And it's going to put tremendous pressure, particularly in the South, in Greece and Italy, and in France and Germany. Now, why did I start this whole analysis with that brief article from Stratfor, dated the same day, about protesters moving to the American air base, the NATO air base at Incirlik, at the city of Adana? Well, I suspect that what you're seeing there is a pattern that is being tested. In other words, I think that you have possibly the Turks, and very possibly with Russian advice, testing a model by which they might pressure the removal of NATO air bases in Turkey. And I think you're going to see that pressure notched up. I think Erdogan eventually is going to demand that those air bases be withdrawn, and again, he will get Russian support for it. Now, the response that would bring from the United States is going to be very interesting, because on the one hand, the United States can simply flatly refuse, but in doing so, it loses face with the rest of the world. Because then Turkey and Russia can say, well, you see, now it really is an empire. They're not really interested in democracy, and so on and so forth. And that will spread. So, in other words, the United States is in a lose-lose situation here. It can close down the airbase, but if it does that, it then looks weak and caving into pressure. And if that happens, that pressure will spread to Europe. Trust me here. It will spread to Italy. It will spread to Greece. It may spread to Spain. And I suspect eventually it will spread to Central Europe, even into Germany. Eastern Europe alone will decide to remain with NATO. And I think if you go back to things I said years and years ago on George Ann Hughes' Bite Show, I think this was also anticipated by American planners, as you see them shifting their bases out of Western Europe and into the worst possible strategic military situation into Eastern Europe. So this business in Turkey, I think, is a clue that we're watching a geopolitical realignment. I want you to watch the way now that the NATO bases are going to be targeted for public protest. Watch the way that Russia and Turkey negotiate concerning Turkey's support, previous support for Islamic terrorist organizations, and so on. The bottom line here for me, folks, is that I think what Russia is trying to do is that Russia is trying to revive the old Westphalian peace international order by saying, all right, we will recognize your right as Islamic culture to exist and so on, but you must recognize our right. In other words, Russia is trying to maneuver, in my opinion, for a secularist solution to this situation along the lines of the Westphalian peace, which, again, this article brings out the West itself has helped destroy by backing all these radical groups. So this is going to be a very, very interesting time, folks. These are high octane speculations, to be sure, but I think we're watching the emergence of a pattern. That's it for today's news and views. I'll see everybody on the flip side, and bye bye, and God bless.